Whish-Wilson.
Deputy President, shortly before I started in the Senate, a friend of mine, Peter Lloyd, gave me a book to read, which he told me was essential for any new MP. Standing here tonight, I only realised just how important and how right he was. The book, Don't Think of an Elephant, by cognitive linguist George Lakoff, is essential reading. For those Australians bewildered by how this Liberal national government can be so ferocious and effective in undermining good public policy, such as pricing pollution or implementing a fairer tax system for all Australians, I recommend you read this book. Lakoff explains why the Conservative side of politics have been devastatingly effective in promoting their own agendas by consistent, disciplined, simple and emotive messaging designed to attack and undermine progressive politics, and not just in this country. One focus for Lakoff is the subject of taxes, which are a good thing, but are consistently painted by Conservatives as an evil. Sound familiar? Lakoff goes on to explain that taxes are a critical part of any democracy. Taxes are roads, taxes are hospitals, taxes are law and order, and taxes are safety nets for the poor. Taxes help build economies and create jobs. I would fall off my Senate bench if I ever heard these points publicly acknowledged across the chamber. It certainly hasn't rated a mention in any of their debate speeches on this subject. It doesn't fit their simple and glib messaging and their fundamentally dishonest spin. In an ideal world, good tax policy would focus less on taxing effort, or what economists call work, and more on taxing the bads, such as pollution, example being a fuel excise or excise on tobacco. We would also focus taxation on equitable levying of the public good across common resources, such as the economic rents from our abundant mineral wealth. The tragedy of the commons and the fair setting of property rights on public goods is understood by most first-year economic students, but seemingly not by those on the other side of the chamber. Don't just take my word for this. This logic was inherent in recommendations made by the Henry Tax Review. Ken Henry, the man who was at the helm of Treasury through much of the Howard Costello so-called glory years of economic management in this country. I was lucky enough to be in the audience for a speech Ken Henry gave at the University of Tasmania. The very same night, in fact the very same minute, his resignation came into effect and he stepped down and was a free man. When asked by a young student what he thought was the biggest challenge facing this country at the end of his speech, he replied, "A lack of political conviction for reform." Today in this chamber, I see and feel this firsthand. Henry said he hoped the bright young students in the audience went on to careers in public service and politics and helped make this necessary change happen. How ironic that now the Liberal National Party don't respect the vision or legacy of this man. How can they when they are turning their backs on many of his important recommendations for reform, including a mining super profits tax? Let me be clear. Ken Henry designed the super profit tax to improve the taxation of resources. State governments currently tax resource projects through inefficient state royalties. These are generally based on a fixed amount per tonne of production or a fixed percentage of the value of production. Resource commodity prices are volatile, but trends show iron ore up 700% and coal 100% since 2004. Add to this record volumes of production and shipments of both coal and iron ore. The current mining taxation regime has caused fewer benefits to accrue to the community as a proportion of these increased profits. In 2001, mining companies paid approximately 40% of their profits as royalties to state governments. Today they pay less than 20%. Let's also not forget that the mining boom, while it has no doubt been a bonanza to big foreign-owned corporations, has had its downsides for the Australian economy. We need a more honest debate about this, if that is all possible in today's politics. Employment in mining is often cyclical and short-term in nature. The mining boom has given a sugar hit to the West Australian economy, but Western Australia needs more eggs in its basket if it wants to secure its economic future. As my colleague Senator Ludlam has so eloquently pointed out, the state must diversify its economy. At least Senator Ludlam and the Greens have a plan to do this. This government's economic plan for WA is simply to axe the tax, and suddenly tens of thousands of jobs will be created overnight. This is not a plan, this is a scam or a sham. Hopefully the government will have the guts to turn up to debate Senator Ludlam on his vision for the WA economy over coming weeks. We, the Greens, believe the Australian people who own the mineral wealth that is to be extracted deserve a greater share of today's profits. This is exactly what this tax was supposed to rectify. And this begs the question, why is this policy being scrapped by this government? The biggest porky of all being pushed by this government is that the mining tax has contributed to sovereign risk that is impacting on mining investment and employment. Sovereign risk, also called country risk, is made up of both political risk and broader economic risks, such as inflation, interest rates, volatile exchange rates, etc. Australia ranks in the top 10 global investment destinations on a variety of independent global assessments of this risk. We are by any means a low-risk investment destination. This same argument was used generations ago against the introduction of a petroleum resource rent tax, that it would devastate employment and investment in the Australian energy industry. And what claptrap that has turned out to be. If you want to ask about sovereign risk, go speak to the ex-CEO of Rio Tinto, Tom Albanese, about real sovereign risk destination, West Africa. He lost his job as CEO of Rio Tinto after a $3.4 billion write-down, a loss on their investment in Mozambique. Or ask the other employees of Rio Tinto Mozambique who have had to leave the country amid security concerns. Or go ask the Australian companies that received recently successfully a $100 million Australian government export assistance loan to do business in Chile because the project was too risky for conventional finance. In justification for this loan in question time last week, Senator Cormann made some comments about finance markets not working efficiently overseas. So the Australian government has had to step in and provide finance on what is already a well-established project in Chile. South America, like West Africa, is a high-risk, sovereign risk destination. Australia is not. What overseas mining company has asked their government to invest taxpayer dollars to cover their risk of investing in Australia? Not one. This debate should be called Mining the Truth debate, because there is so much dishonesty and selective debate surrounding it. The real reason the government is seeking to overturn this tax reform is simple. The old royalty system, which has a lower impact on their profits, suits the profit-chasing nature of big business and their drive for shareholder returns. Economists call this rent-seeking behaviour, and this is what underlies the advocacy of big business groups and their lobbyists. Our miners earn huge economic rents. They pay lower tax rates than most Australians, and they are heavily subsidised by the taxpayer. According to the Australian Institute, fuel tax credits are worth $2.35 billion a year to the mining industry. The wealthy miners also get $495 million in annual tax write-offs for capital works and an additional $550 million in deductions for exploration and prospecting. Add in other government incentives such as generous research and development, tax concessions and taxpayer-funded infrastructure investments, and the annual number climbs to over $4 billion of Australian taxpayer subsidies per annum. The mining industry effective tax rate of 13.9% is also far lower than the average of other industries in this country of around 21%. The mining industry also combines its corporate tax rate with royalties in order to argue that it is highly taxed. But royalties, Mr. Acting Deputy President, are the cost of raw materials, no different from when a restaurant buys food or bricklayers buy bricks. These industries don't count these inputs as taxes. We, the Australian people, through our governments, sell resources to the big miners. Of course, we should seek a better and fairer price, a bigger share of the pie. But the big end of town, pulling the strings of this puppet government, doesn't want to give it to you. A whopping $22 million was spent by big business just on advertising against the first super profit tax. And I know we've heard in just about every debate from the opposition, should clarify the Liberal National Government, that this led to the downfall of Mr Kevin Rudd, Prime Minister at the time. This debate is indeed about the profits of big business. It's about protecting them. Don't believe the mining industry or the coalition when they cry poor. The Liberal National Government are right about one thing in this debate. The MRRT is not the original super profits tax, and it has been a failure in delivering its revenue objectives. Only $126 million has been raised in the first 6 months of introduction, yet $4 billion was expected to be raised this financial year under the revised version negotiated by Prime Minister Gillard. And it's also worth noting that only BHP paid any mining tax for the year to December 31st, 2013. This is despite the profits of the three big iron ore companies to whom it applies, BHP, Rio Tinto and Xstrata, having risen by 81% in this financial year. Their combined half-year profits are $14.6 billion, and 83% of these profits go offshore. So any super profit tax is essentially a tax on foreign shareholders, a transfer of wealth from foreigners to Australians who own these resources. Note that without the MRRT in place, their profits would still be a staggering $14.81 billion. The current super profit tax takes a meagre 1.5% off their extravagant headline profits. And for this government, that is still too much. This government would prefer to charge people to see their local doctor or make life harder for small business. The Greens want to fix this tax on wealthy miners and their super profits. We stand alone in this regard. We want to fix it for a more fair and equitable Australia. We have been consistent on this matter. We support the original Henry super profits tax. According to the Parliamentary Budget Office, fixing the tax would yield $26 billion over the next 4 years. Removing mining depreciation allowance additionally would add another $2.2 billion to be spent on healthcare and looking after our vulnerable. It is important to point out that the proceeds of this mega profit mining tax were designed to be spent on pensions and tax cuts for small business infrastructure projects, particularly in WA and Queensland. Treasury and independent modelling forecast a $450 million per year gain to the Australian economy due to flow-on results of company tax and tax breaks for small business. The mining tax was also forecast to reduce the cost of living and increase employment, contrary to what Senator Matthias Cormann's false and unsubstantiated claims have been made in this chamber. Mr Acting Deputy President, small business is the backbone of our nation. Nearly 2 million businesses employing nearly half this nation's taxpayers. My wife and I have run 2 small businesses for the past decade. My wife currently employs 16 people in our hometown of Launceston. We know, unlike many in this chamber, how tough it is to get out of bed and to go to work because no one else will if you don't. The long hours, the risks of losing it all. I'm sure no one from the Liberal Party would disagree with what I'm saying here tonight. So why are they penalising Australian small business with this legislation? Why are they removing the instant asset write-off thresholds and loss carryback provisions, effective tax breaks for struggling, hard-working small business in Australia? This anti-small business legislation reduces the flexibility and cash flows of small business right across the country. I note with pride that the Greens want to increase the instant asset threshold to $10,000, not to wind it back to a paltry $1,000. And we want to give small business a bigger tax cut to help grow the national economy. And we ran a policy going to the last federal election fully costed to do this, to reduce the corporate tax rate for small business to 28%. Previous attempts to do this had been voted down by the Liberal National Government. Why? Simply because they feel they have small business vote in their back pocket in this country, so they can take them for granted. So I asked again, why? Why are the Liberal National Government turning their backs on small business in this country? They're doing this because they are puppets on a string to the big end of town, because they care more about maintaining the huge profits of mining companies than Aussie battlers. Looking at the legislative agenda that we've had in this chamber now for many months, it's all about ripping up and tearing down. But I've yet to see any vision or any alternatives for any employment opportunities. The mantra that suddenly we're going to cut taxes and everything's going to be okay certainly doesn't wash it with me, and I don't think it'll wash it with the Australian people. This bill is another example of this Liberal National Government legislating for special interests over public interests. As it is with the carbon bills, where the big end of town, the big dirty polluters, have run a campaign against the entire clean energy package because it is a threat to their business, a threat to the energy market and their hold on the energy market. Legislating for the big polluters over the environment and community and future economy, it's becoming a bit like Groundhog Day in here. This government will go to any length to push its short-sighted and dangerous agenda. We've seen this week, and also last week, the government's attempt to push through the Faux reforms, which I will highlight Senator Daciari in the chamber here tonight happens to know a lot about. And it's become very clear, thanks to an article in Crikey on Friday afternoon, that the Liberal Party has been a big beneficiary of donations from the big end of town, the big banks, AMP, who stand so much to gain for not seeing these reforms pushed through. These sensible reforms backed by the financial planning industry. They don't want to see conflicted remuneration. They want to see these conflicts of interest removed so that the industry can get back on an even keel. They've suffered reputational damage because a lot of the products and the way they've been sold have been unethical and have lost investors a lot of money. And we talked a little bit about the Liberal National Government's obsession with managed investment schemes, which I hope we'll hear a lot more about in the coming years. The government's agenda, if you could even call it an agenda, is designed to further its own short-term political interests at the expense of good public policy and the broader interests of the Australian people and the future of this nation. And although we do a lot of good work in this chamber, I still can't help not finishing on the note and thinking as I was putting this speech together tonight about Ken Henry's words in the lecture theatre at the University of Tasmania. The clock had struck 6 and he said to everyone, "I'm officially retired." And someone said, "Well, are you going to speak your mind tonight, Ken?" And he said, I still have a lot of respect for the politicians and the people I've worked with in the system over the years." And he gave a very good speech, very balanced, and it wasn't until we got to question time that this young lady put up her hand and she said, "What is the biggest challenge?" It was the first question. What is the biggest challenge facing this country? And he said, "A lack of political conviction for reform." This is a man who'd been and seen it all and certainly has tripartisan respect from everything that I've seen. And when I look at why he is right and why we are failing by trying to put this type of legislation up to tear down what is good public policy, that needs to be fixed, no doubt about that. When I ask myself why, I can only see one reason, and that is this government is governing for big business, not for what is in the interest of most Australians. And I'll certainly be voting against this bill, as will Senator Di Natale and all of the Greens.